Hello humans, I am the Black Cat and welcome to Weird Wednesday. Today's mystery is an enigma wrapped in a puzzle, or a puzzle wrapped in an enigma. Today we take a look at the Villisca axe murders. For this story, we have to travel back in time to 1912 in Iowa in the United States. On the 9th of June 1912, Joshua Moore, who owned a local farm supply shop in town, and his wife Sarah took their 4 children, Herman, aged 11, Catherine, aged 10, and Boyd, aged 7, and 5-year-old Paul, to the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church at around 8 p.m. Accompanying them were Lena, aged 12, and Ina Stillinger, aged 8. They were neighbor children who had asked their parents permission to stay overnight with the Moore children because it was dark by the time the service finished, and apparently they were afraid to walk to their grandmother's house in the dark, so they thought it was safer to go with the Moore family. After the service, the families mingled until around 9:30 p.m, at which time the Moore family and the Stillinger children walked home. Their home was about 3 blocks away, so they arrived home at about 10 p.m. At 5 a.m. the next day, on the 10th June, the Moore's neighbour, Mary Peckham, was hanging laundry out in her backyard and noted that the Moore house was quiet, but it was still early, so she didn't think anything of it. By 7 a.m, she noticed that the Moore house was still quiet. There was no movement or sounds of children. The chickens were still in their pen and the animals hadn't been fed. Mary naturally thought this was strange because they would normally be moving about at this time feeding the animals. So she decided to go over and knock on the door. Upon receiving no answer and still no sound coming from the house, she tried to open the door, but it was locked. At this point, Mary started to become concerned, so she called Josiah's brother, Ross, to come and see if he could find out what was going on. She noticed the animals still hadn't been tended to, so she also called Ed Shealy, an employee of Josiah's who was working at the Moore shop. Soon after, Mary noticed Ed Shealy entering the barn to feed the horses before Ross arrived. Ed stated that he just went into the barn, fed the horses, and then went back to the shop without going to the house. When Ross arrived at the house, he knocked on the door and called out to his brother, but there was no answer. Ross tried the back door, but it was also locked. He tried peeking through windows, but he couldn't see anything because the windows were covered. Finally, after receiving no response from inside, Ross decided to use his key to open the front door. Just a side note, at this point is rather confusing. One source says that Ross used his own key, another says he found the spare key, and yet another says that he used a skeleton key. So where the key came from that Ross used to open the door that was apparently locked from the inside is in itself a question. What key did he use? Anyway, Ross entered the house while Mary waited outside. When Ross entered the downstairs bedroom, he found the bodies of Lena and Ina still in bed, covered in blood. He quickly left and told Mary to call the sheriff. City Marshal Hank Horton soon arrived with Dr. J. Clark Cooper and entered the house. He found not only the Stillinger sisters, but also the entire Moore family were also still in their beds and covered in blood. They had all been bludgeoned to death while they slept. Dr. J. Clark Cooper estimated that they had been dead for around 5 to 6 hours, judging by how much the blood had dried. They also had clothes thrown over their faces. Dr. Cooper believed they were covered up after they had been killed because the clothes covering them didn't have much blood on them and there wasn't any damage to the clothes themselves. There were also clothes covering all the mirrors in the house. In Josiah and Sarah's room, they found an oil lamp at the foot of the bed. The glass cover had been removed and the wick had been bent, presumably to prevent the lamp from being too bright. They also found that Sarah's shoes were moved, presumably being kicked by the killer. One shoe was on its side with blood on the bottom and inside the shoe. Horton guessed that this showed the killer returned to the room after he killed them and knocked the shoe over in the dark. Just outside the room, at the doorway, they found a pool of blood. They believe that the killer may have stood there with the axe at his side for a few minutes, with the blood dripping from the axe. Was he admiring his work? Or was he making sure there was no movement? Or could he have been watching someone else? In both the parents' and the Moore children's room, there were gash marks on the ceiling. Investigators believe they were caused by the killer swinging the axe over his head. In the downstairs bedroom, the Stillinger sisters were found. Unfortunately, because the Stillinger girls weren't members of the Moore family, no one knew who they were at first. Because the damage done to them, no one could recognize them. In this room, they found another oil lamp, also with the glass cover removed. Why were 2 lamps was used. In this room they also found the axe. Apparently it was Josiah's axe that he kept outside. The axe looked like the killer may have tried to clean it. Strangely, next to the axe was a slab of bacon. A similar slab of bacon was found in the family's icebox, leading investigators to believe that the killer took it out of the icebox. Also, in this room they found a small piece of a keychain. Whether or not that was connected to the killer or was already there is not known. One thing about the Stillinger sisters that is different from the others is that Lena, the older of the sisters, was apparently moved in the bed. Either she moved herself after being hit, perhaps her body reacting, or she was moved after she was killed. Either way, she was a little further down on the bed. Bloodstains on her pillow suggest that her head was on the pillow at the moment of impact, but she was found about a third of the way down the bed. Another disturbing point is that her nightgown had rolled up. It could have been moved up as she slid down, or the alternative, because she also didn't have any undergarments on. There was also apparently a smear of blood on the inside of her right knee. She apparently was also the only one to have what Dr. Williams, the doctor who examined the bodies, believed to be a defensive wound on her arm, suggesting that she was awake at some point. However, Dr. Williams says he doesn't believe there was any SA. He stated that he found no evidence to support that idea. In the kitchen, they found a pan with bloody water in it, suggesting that the killer attempted to clean themselves up. There was also a plate of food that wasn't eaten, so maybe the killer, after cleaning themselves, was going to eat but decided to just leave. Who knows? My personal theory, and this is just a random thought, maybe the killer didn't know the Stillinger sisters were there, and when they went down to get something to eat, they were surprised to find them. Maybe Lena woke up and made a noise. That could be why there's another lamp used, and why Lena seems to have moved more than the others. Maybe the surprise of finding the sisters caused the killer to leave quicker, thus leaving the plate of food and the bacon slab out. That's just a thought. Interestingly, all the doors were locked, apparently from the inside. It was known that Josiah would lock up the house every night before going to bed, so more likely than not, Josiah locked up the house that night. So that leaves us with the question, how did the killer get into the house? One source I read suggested the killer entered the house after midnight, but again, how? Another source suggested that the killer entered the house while the family were at the church service and hid in the attic. Apparently, investigators found some cigarette butts in the attic, suggesting that the killer or killers hid up there until the family went to bed. But that also leaves us with the question of how did they leave the house? I found no suggestion that any windows or doors were broken, meaning the killer would have had to have unlocked the door and then locked it again as they left. Did they also have a magic key or know where the Moore family kept their spare key? One witness, Edward Landers, was visiting his mother just a few houses away from the Moore house and stated that that night he heard what he thought was the sound of one boy hooting for another outside somewhere. He didn't think anything of it and went to sleep. Only after hearing about the murders, he thought the sound could have been a woman moaning. Considering he was in bed going to sleep, he wasn't really sure about the exact time, however. But being pressed for a time, he said it would have been around 11 p.m. Apparently news of the murders soon spread through the town and hundreds of curious people flocked to the house, went in and looked at the bodies. The Villisca National Guard arrived and soon took control of the crime scene, but not before it was trampled by hundreds of people. The same day the bodies were found, the idea that it was a deranged traveller, what they called a tramp in those days, was responsible. They expected to find him drenched in blood and hiding in a barn somewhere. So posses were formed to ride out of town in all directions on horseback and in automobiles, but they couldn't find anyone. Similar groups formed and searched the streets and down alleys, searching every barn, shed, everywhere in town. They too failed to find anyone. When you think about it, even though the killer attempted to wash up with the water in the kitchen, there's no way they would have been able to completely clean all the blood off. They would have to have been able to change clothes, maybe even have a bath, so the idea that it was a homeless traveller doesn't really make sense to me. However, there were also 2 bloodhounds that were brought in by train who apparently were able to pick up a scent, even though there were literally hundreds of people just trampling the crime scene. But the dogs apparently lost the trail at the Nodaway River. Sadly, during all this searching and ordering bloodhounds, the bodies of the victims remained in the house. They apparently weren't cleared to be removed by the coroner until 11 p.m. Monday night. M.W. McClory, a fingerprint expert, arrived the next day but was unable to find any useful fingerprints. I wonder why. However, he did do an analysis of the blood splatter and the axe marks found at the scene. He concluded that the killer was most likely left-handed and that he believed the Stillinger sisters were killed in a frenzy and that he was only using one hand to hold the axe. There were several suspects at the time, and even more over time as people look back at the case. Before Josiah Moore opened his own store in town, he used to work for another store owner named Frank Jones. Apparently Frank Jones was angry at Josiah Moore when he left his employ to open his own shop. Josiah also managed to take a John Deere contract to his new store. With Villisca being a farming town, this would be a very big deal. The suggestion is that Frank Jones may have paid someone to kill Josiah. The person he allegedly hired was William Mansfield. A detective, James Wilkinson, believed that William Mansfield was a serial killer. There was apparently other murders that matched the Villisca murders, including the use of an axe, the lamps that were left, and the mirrors in the houses covered. Detective Wilkinson believed that William Mansfield was responsible for all the killings. However, it was found that William actually wasn't in Villisca at the time, and he was able to prove it with pay slips, so that theory went out the window. Once he was cleared, William sued Detective Wilkinson for the accusation, and apparently he won his case. Reverend George Kelly was a travelling preacher. He and his wife had settled in Villisca, and apparently he was invited to attend the children's service on the same night that the Moore family was there. He also apparently left town early the next morning, making him look kinda suspicious. I saw one article saying that while he was leaving on the train at 5 a.m, he allegedly told travellers there were 8 dead souls back in Villisca, butchered in their beds while they slept, even though the bodies would not actually be discovered until 7 a.m, a good 2 hours later. However, I couldn't find any other reference to this statement, so I don't know if that's true or not. However, Reverend Kelly would become obsessed with the case and would continuously send letters to the investigators. Around 1914, Kelly would spend some time in a mental hospital. Then, in 1917, he was arrested for the murders, but because they didn't have any actual evidence, they needed him to confess. They apparently grilled him for hours, with each investigator playing the bad cop. Eventually, they would break up for the night and left Kelly in a cell with 2 new cellmates. These men would claim to be thieves with experience with law enforcement, and they assured Kelly that confession is the best idea. Obviously, they were actually law enforcement themselves, but their strategy worked, and Kelly, after several days of psychological torture, broke down and confessed to the murders. It went to trial, but the sheriff's methods were also brought to light, and the jury didn't believe that Kelly's confession was genuine, so he was released. Henry Lee Moore, who is no relation to Josiah Moore, was a convicted murderer who had killed his mother and grandmother in order to get his mother's house. He also used an axe to kill them, but was soon caught and sent to prison. However, it's believed that he may have killed more people, including the Moore family, but it was never proven that he killed anyone other than his mother and grandmother. Sam Moyer was Josiah Moore's brother-in-law and had apparently threatened to kill Josiah before. However, after investigating him, they ruled him out as a suspect because he was in a different location at the time and wouldn't have had time to travel to Josiah's house and back again. In 2017, Bill James released a book called The Man on the Train. In the book, Bill suggests the idea that the family was murdered by a serial killer named Paul Mueller. Apparently, Paul Mueller was active at the time. He would be from around the right area, and his method of killing was very similar to the scene that was found at the Villisca house, including covering the victim's head with clothes and covering windows, and using the victim's own axe to do the killings. any traveler or vagrant that was in the area. Investigators floated the idea that the killer could be a vagrant, someone who didn't really have a home and would travel around a lot. Because of this, a lot of people who were just traveling around the area were brought in for questioning. One such man was rowing a boat down the Nottoway River without a hat or shirt. However, no one seemed to fit, and after over 100 years, the case still remains unsolved. This is just my own thought, but I'd like to put Josiah's brother Ross on the list. I think it's interesting that even though the house was locked up from the inside, he either had it on him or was able to access a spare key. Because that's one of the points that no one has been able to figure out. How did the killer or killers leave the house when it was discovered to be locked from the inside? The killer would had to have locked the doors behind him on his way out. Ross was apparently the only one to have a key to the house other than the family. Also, the fact that he got there relatively quickly after Mary called him. Was he perhaps waiting for the call? So moving forward in time to 1994, and plans were being made to turn the house into a historical museum as a sort of tourist attraction. Apparently the house had sat empty for several years, and there were plans to sell the property to someone who wanted to bulldoze the house and develop the property. So a local couple named Darwin and Martha Lynn, who thought the house should be preserved as part of Villisca's history, decided to buy it. They turned the house into a museum with an overnight stay, which attracted a lot of visitors. Most of the visitors would be paranormal investigators. In 2014, a man would book an overnight stay in the museum. Johnny, the caretaker, noticed that he had a knife on his belt and was dressed in camo, but that was apparently common for the area, so he thought nothing of it. Apparently the man wanted to provoke the ghosts.
Come at me, ghosts!
I don't know why. Provoking is something that some ghost hunters will do just to get a reaction. It's kind of disrespectful in my opinion, and most reputable ghost investigators don't do that. Anyway, the man booked to stay alone in the house. The next day when his parents arrived to pick him up, they found him on the floor with his knife in his chest. He was rushed to hospital and survived. When questioned later what happened, the man said he didn't know. He stated that all he remembered was he was provoking the ghosts, and next thing he knew he was waking up in hospital. So is there some kind of evil force in that house? Well, when you consider that lots of people have stayed in the house at that point and nothing had happened before or since, it's probably more likely not the ghost's fault. Maybe he had some kind of accident. So as I said, a lot of paranormal investigators have visited the house in order to potentially talk to the ghosts of the Moore family or the Stillinger sisters. So what kind of evidence has been captured? Many years ago, I remember coming across a video from the paranormal investigation team called Prism Paranormal, who did several investigations in the house over a number of years. The video showed a closet door in the kids' room opening and closing by itself. They also captured several EVPs of children talking to each other.
Hey sweetie, can you close the door?
It's definitely interesting, and I think I'll link the full videos in the description. These were the videos that I first heard about the Villisca axe murder house from. Are there still the ghosts of these children in that house? I hope not. I think opening up the house to the public would bring a lot of energy to the house, mostly negative energy, because most people would go there with thoughts of murder and ghosts, and they would bring that energy there. So over the years, there would be a build-up of this energy, making it seem more spooky. Personally, I don't think ghosts stay in one place. I mean, how boring would it be to hang around the same house for years, just listening to the story of how you were murdered day after day for years? I think ghosts come and go. That's why some places investigators get lots of evidence and the next day they get nothing. I think anyone who's lived in a haunted house would tell you that stuff doesn't happen every day. Sometimes it's days, months, even years can go by without a peep, because time is a human concept that doesn't really exist in the spirit world. That's just my way of thinking. Anyway, I'm rambling. That's all the time I have for this mystery. What are your thoughts? Do you think the killer is one of the suspects or a completely different person who went unnoticed? What could have been the motive? Was Josiah the main target, or was it Sarah and the kids were killed just to keep them quiet? Do you think the house is haunted? Let me know your thoughts. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!